Hey there, everybody. In the first couple chapters, we looked at some high-level issues that affect auditors. We talked about the code of conduct that auditors are required to follow when they conduct an audit. We looked at some ethical dilemmas auditors can fall into. Now in Chapter 3, we're going to actually start looking at what happens when an auditor undertakes an engagement. So this is the first of two chapters on risk assessment, which is the first stage of actually conducting an audit. So before we even begin the engagement, the auditor has to make the decision as to whether they want to undertake the engagement. So this can happen with an existing client. So maybe we've audited somebody's books in the past. Well, we have to make a decision. Do we want to continue working with them in the future? And this is also a decision that's really critical if we want to take on a new client, right? We really want to make sure that this is a client, in fact, that we want to work with. So there's four main factors that we take into consideration when we're trying to decide if we want to accept a new client or retain an old one. We talked in Chapter 2 about the idea of competence and independence. Competence just basically means that we, as the auditor, have the skills necessary to actually complete the audit. So sometimes we might run into competence issues when we are dealing with a client that works in an industry that we haven't had experience with in the past. Maybe the client has special transactions that we need a specialist to come in and look at. And if we don't have the relationship with a specialist, that could be an issue for us to be able to effectively perform this audit. And also independence. Of course, our independence is critical to keep our reputation in good standing. So we really want to investigate and make sure that there's not going to be any issues on this audit that could threaten our independence. And then every audit is unique. Every client is a little bit different. So there's special circumstances and unusual risks that can pop up with an audit engagement. So there's almost an infinite list of different things that can occur. A couple of the primary ones or biggest issues that occur are limitations in the scope of the audit. So if we feel like a client might not be willing to give us full access to all the information we need to complete the audit, all right, that's going to be a red flag, maybe warning us that we shouldn't take on this client. Also, if the client has had issues with profitability in the past, or if they have a faulty accounting system, maybe there's special regulatory reporting requirements. All these are different issues that could be potential red flags that might lead us not to accept the engagement. One big factor that I want to talk about in more detail is the integrity of management. So as an auditor, we're going in to provide an opinion on management's assertions in the financial statements. Basically, we're there to give reasonable assurance that there's no material misstatements in the financial statements. The issue is that, remember, the audit isn't foolproof. We don't give 100% assurance that there's no material misstatements. So there could be misstatements in the financial statements, material misstatements, that we don't catch. So we want to make sure that the management of the company that we're auditing has the utmost integrity, because if they lack integrity, that means maybe there's a higher probability that there could be misstatements that we won't catch, and that could affect our reputation. That could put us in legal jeopardy. So we want to look at management and try to decide, do they have high levels of integrity? And a couple of different things that we're kind of investigating when we undertake this decision is looking at the reputation of the client and its management, right? Basically looking at any potential instances of fraud or other criminal activity in the past. And we want to think about, why are they actually switching audit firms if that's the case? If they're asking us to be their new auditor, well, why did they get rid of the last one? Was there issues on the past auditor's part that they didn't want to take on this client again? If so, that maybe can be a potential issue with the management's integrity. Also, the level of risk that the management takes on, their attitude towards internal controls or other big factors we want to take into consideration. The better a client's internal controls are, the less work we have to do on the audit to give that reasonable assurance. And also, a really huge thing is potential scope limitations, meaning is management, or do we think that management might in the future not give us access to all the information that we need to actually conduct the audit? Will they prevent us from talking with key personnel in the company that we need access to make our audit opinion? So the question is, how do we go about figuring out whether management does have a high level of integrity? It's not something we can know with 100% assurance, but there's some things that we can kind of investigate that give us a higher level of confidence that we're dealing with management that is kind of upholding a high level of integrity within the company. So one thing we could do is communications with the people working at the company. Of course, we want to talk with management, kind of get a feel for how they operate, talk with personnel working in the accounting department, communicating with outside parties that deal with this company, talking to their bank, maybe talking to past suppliers to get a feel for how this company operates, and also talking with the peers in the industry, maybe other companies in that industry, to get their take on the level of integrity of the management of the firm that we might audit. And then there's just more mundane things we could do, kind of Google searches, looking at past newspaper online articles about the client, doing investigations into trade journals. All these things kind of give us insight into how management operates. And one thing that we're required to do is have a communication with the prior auditor. So we have to have a sign off from our client to allow us to speak with a prior auditor. And there's some questions we want to ask this prior auditor to get a feel for how the company operates. So we want to talk to them about any information that they have about the integrity of management, and also any disagreements they had with management about accounting policies or audit procedures. Now, they could have disagreements that don't indicate that there's an issue with management integrity. Maybe they just have different point of views and they had disagreements, or maybe these disagreements could stem from legitimate problems on management's part. Also, we want to discuss any communications between the auditor and management revolving around fraud. That's a really big red flag. If there's been past instances of fraud or potential fraud, we want to know about that up front. And also we want to know about any material weaknesses in internal control. Again, a company with good internal controls makes it less likely they're going to have material misstatements on their financials. And also, we want to know from the past auditor's perspective why there was a change in auditors. Again, there could be a very mundane, run-of-the-mill reason why we had this change, or there could be something more nefarious at play. Perhaps the past auditor didn't want to renew their contract with this client because they were worried about potential fraud or the integrity of management. So those are things that we want to know. And also, one last thing that we want to inquire about is the prior auditor's understanding of any significant unusual transactions or related party transactions. So an example of a related party transaction where companies have had problems in the past is where a company will make loans to executives within the company. So that could be kind of a red flag that maybe some fraud or potential malfeasance could occur. So once we do this investigation of management, once we speak with the prior auditor, and let's say that we feel like after we had all these discussions and have done this background check that we want to proceed with the audit engagement, we have to create a formal contract called the engagement letter. And basically the engagement letter just lays out the responsibility of both parties. So it's typically prepared before the audit engagement begins, and it's the contract between the auditor and their client. And you're always going to have an engagement letter with a new client. You're not necessarily required to have an engagement letter with a prior client. So if you've been doing a client's audits for years and you decide you want to take them on for next year's audit, you're not legally required to have an engagement letter, but almost all audit firms in practice do have engagement letters. And it's just kind of a way for us to safeguard our interests as auditors, to have a contract spelling out our responsibilities to management and management's responsibilities to us. So within this engagement letter, we have an explanation of the scope of the audit, talking about what we're actually going to do within the audit. And we're going to tell management when they could expect the audit to be completed. Remember, this is something we talked about back in Chapter 2 when we looked at legal responsibilities of auditors. If we actually don't complete the audit and provide the audit report by the date that we had agreed to in the engagement letter, we could be legally liable. We could face a breach of contract. Also, we want to lay out the client's responsibility for the preparation of the financial statements. The financial statements are the responsibility of management, so we want to lay that out in the engagement letter. And also we want to make sure that the auditor has access to all information, again, required to conduct the audit. If management doesn't give us access to documentations or they don't allow us to speak with key individuals in the company, that's considered a scope limitation. So we want to lay out in the engagement letter the terms of the expectations in regards to our access to information. And finally, we want to lay out any issues with independence, and we want to discuss or lay out what the fee structure is going to be for the audit. Recall again, this is something we talked about in Chapter 2. Auditors are not allowed to have contingent fees or commissions with the audit. So basically you have to have kind of the price of the audit laid out in stone beforehand, because if we had any contingent fees or commissions, that could be a violation of integrity. And of course, we want to uphold the highest level of integrity as an auditor.